If you're a fan of Looking Glass Studios, the past couple of years have been surprisingly exciting. After being able to retrieve the rights to Ultima Underworld,
from the bowels of EA,
Paul Neurath founded Otherside Entertainment to helm Underworld Ascendant. Meanwhile, a startup called Night Dive Studios managed to similarly retrieve the rights of System Shock.
From the bowels of Meadowbrook Insurance Group. I don't understand.
And had gotten the first two games in working condition and onto digital storefronts. Soon after, Otherside announced that it had gained the rights from Night Dive in order to make System Shock 3, and Night Dive itself announced that they were making System Shock Remastered.
Well, for starters, it's not called SS Remastered, it's just System Shock. It is a full reboot, not a remastering.
Oh, sorry Jason. System Shock Reboot, a remake of the original game in contemporary technology. So, a series that hasn't had a game since 1993 is getting a new one, and a series that hasn't had a game since 1999 is now getting two. For all intents and purposes, Otherside Entertainment looks like Looking Glass 2.0. So, System Shock 2 came out 18 years ago at the time of writing, and it's still held up in some circles as one of the best games of all time, an opinion I agree with. A lot of Looking Glass games are now considered classics, and the Shock games have given us Shodan, one of the most iconic villains in the medium. It was also co-developed with Irrational Games, a studio that's become synonymous with Ken Levine, one of the 5 game designers the average game player can name and frontman for Maroon 5. Having played and replayed the game myself though, I understand its quality, but I've always been bothered by my inability to express why it's so good. Additionally, I'm left to wonder why more people haven't played it. I've had a couple friends tell me they've tried to pick it up, but didn't get very far because of how unwelcoming it was. I mean, the first proper level of the game is MedSci, which I thought was pretty effective at communicating the tone. Is there something here that's preventing more people from getting in further? What is it about this level that's inviting to some, but off-putting to others? Man, if there were only some pseudo-professional game designer willing to make a long-winded YouTube video about what aspects make it a great game and what aspects may have aged poorly. Hey, wait a minute. Man, I started with a nice simple game, didn't I? We're going to dive into the deep end pretty quick here, so if you're a bit shaky on level design fundamentals, I encourage you to watch my What is Level Design video. First, however, we should look at the gameplay that we actually have to design our level around. Given that this game was co-developed by Looking Glass and Irrational Games, System Shock 2 has a lot of DNA from the immersive sim genre. The immersive simulation, or immersive sim, is a name given to a cluster of games that could loosely be considered a genre. Maybe you've heard them referenced as the 0451 games, referring to the first keypad code in System Shock 1, which in turn was a reference to Fahrenheit 451. Looking Glass themselves arguably invented the genre with the release of Ultima Underworld 1 and 2 in 1992 and 1993 respectively, and the release of System Shock 1 in 1994. Though not as strong of a correlation as the terms shooter or platformer, the immersive sim has some defining traits. First, they're almost always first person. Second, most of them have a strong RPG element. And third, most importantly, is their emphasis on system-driven gameplay. Being system-driven is also referred to as other things. Sometimes it's called player-authored gameplay, and a few people even call it being Breath of the Wild 25 years earlier. At its core, system-driven gameplay is defined by having a variety of objects in the game which all abide by the rules of their systems, but have interesting reactions when they interact with other objects. The result of these interactions is referred to as emergent gameplay, which basically means gameplay that is the logical result of gameplay rules interacting, but is not necessarily anticipated by the designers. While quite frequently emergent gameplay is something that goes against the intention of the game, for example, the movement systems interacting in Counter-Strike allow bunny hopping, immersive sims distinguish themselves through their intent to encourage emergent gameplay.
And they wouldn't necessarily, they would be surprises to me. It's like, oh, is that how you do that? Right? I set up a situation and gave the player a set of tools, right? but then like reading this walkthrough as if like that were the definitive way to play the game, when in fact like parts of it were like surprises to me, right?
The player-authored moniker also clues us into another intention of the immersive sim, creating stories. Suppose a bunch of people are sitting around a table during their lunch break and they're all sharing stories of the events they experienced playing a game. Stories that are all amusing and have a beginning, middle, and end, and are distinct enough from each other to all be novel. Let me ask you this. Is that game they're discussing Portal 2? I'm willing to bet no, because Portal 2 is a game that is designed to tell one story. All the puzzles are intended to have one solution, and all players have the same set of tools to solve them, all of which are introduced at the exact same time. And that's fine. Portal 2 is still one of the best designed games ever, but it's not built to generate multiple stories. To understand how stories are structured, you should watch Every Frame a Painting's video essay on F for Fake. In it, they describe a basic rule of screenwriting. Between two events in a story, there should be a therefore or a but. In other words, two elements in a story, when they interact, should lead to the next event through either a logical extension, a therefore, or by introducing a new conflict, a but. And the systems in Portal 2 do this and do this well. I needed to get to the exit, but it's a floor above me, but there's a tractor beam in the room, therefore I wrote it up. But the door was locked by a button, but I used a portal to push a cube onto it, therefore I could go through the exit. They tell a story, but that's the thing, they tell a story.
When the PlayStation 4 came out, PlayStation 4, and they have this dedicated button, they have the share button on it, right? Which is awesome, right? Until you start using it and you're realizing that all of these games are actually just railroading you in
Right.
all of your
And
shared moments.
So your 20 seconds looks the same as the other guy's 20 seconds, and why is it worth sharing?
A systems-driven game, however, intends to set up its gameplay to be able to generate many stories, and System Shock 2 is no exception. We should probably actually establish the systems of Shock 2 and mechanics. Fortunately, this game is a first-person shooter, so the controls are at least somewhat familiar to most players. Move the mouse to look around, use WASD to move, Q and E to lean left or right, press the spacebar to jump and hold it on the sides of climbable things to climb up them, press Ctrl to toggle crouch, click the left mouse button to use your weapon, and click the right mouse button to interact with objects in the environment. Or, to use the word that Looking Glass originated, frobbing. When the player frobs an object, the player either activates it, causing it to do something, or if it's an item, pick it up. Speaking of which, the player has an inventory, which is accessed using either the tab key or the middle mouse button. The thing is though that this switches modes of the game. Move mode is where the player is able to, move, whereas use mode is where they can access their inventory. However, since the player's mouse is now controlling the cursor, they can't look around, though they can still move. The game around them, however, doesn't pause, leaving them vulnerable to being attacked by enemies. The inventory has finite space, operating on a grid system. If the player can't fit an item on the grid, they can't take it with them. It's also interesting to note that certain items have consistent sizes. Weapons are always 1 square by 3 squares, and armor is always 2 by 2, though this is probably just to keep them the same size so they'll all fit into the equipped weapon or armor slots. Otherwise, most items are a single grid square. The combat is pretty simple. You can use melee weapons, or firearms, which degrade over time. Their condition is on a scale from 0 to 10 and goes down with use, and if it hits 0, becomes jammed and cannot be used anymore. Similarly, most weapons can switch between multiple ammo types. For instance, there's standard pistol ammo, but there's also armor-piercing ammo, which deals extra damage against robots, and anti-personnel ammo, which deal extra damage against non-robots. Additionally, the player can use magic, Psi, which depends on their mana, Psi points. Different Psi abilities can do a variety of different things, from inflicting damage on enemies to healing the player to temporarily boosting certain stats. Interestingly, when the player uses a Psi ability, they're supposed to hold down the left mouse button to charge it up, with a small meter appearing on screen. If they let go of the mouse button when the line reaches the yellow zone to the right, the ability they're casting gets a small boost, getting slightly more effective. However, if the line reaches all the way to the right, the ability is overcast and deals some damage to the player themselves. The player is also able to do some hacking, which operates on a resource called nanites. When a player rubs a hackable object, a screen pops up with a number of nodes on it and allows the player to attempt to hack the object, each attempt costing a certain number of nanites. In order to hack an object, the player needs to succeed at hacking 3 nodes in a row. Every time the player clicks on one, there's a % chance the node will succeed and light up, or fail and go dim. There's also those orange nodes called ice nodes, which players can click on, but if you fail, you get a critical failure depending on the object you're hacking. If the player were hacking a security terminal, for instance, an alarm goes off, whereas if the player were hacking a secured crate, it explodes. The nanites used for hacking are also used for other things, which makes them this kinda weird currency. The player can use them to buy things at vending machines or to modify their weapons, but they're also used by the Bio-Reconstructor. This is a room that the player needs to activate in each map that allows them to respawn there after running out of health at the cost of a few nanites. However, this means that if they die in a map before finding the Reconstructor, they just lose the game, meaning that finding it in each new area is probably the player's first priority, since it immediately lowers the difficulty by a huge factor. Now let's get into stats, which, wait, how many pages do we have left? Oh boy. Okay, I'm just gonna oversimplify things and generalize System Shock 2 as being
Space D&D!
I mean, it's pretty similar. The way I described some of the systems earlier, weapons, hacking, and Sci, basically align with the 3 classes that System Shock 2 provides: combat, tech, and Sci. These are influenced by 5 general stats that everyone has. Strength increases damage dealt and space in the player's inventory. Endurance increases the player's health. Sci increases the player's Sci points and gives access to higher Sci abilities. Agility increases movement speed, and Cyber makes hacking as well as modifying and repairing weapons easier. Additionally, each class has skills associated with them. Both these skills, as well as the player's stats, can be improved through the use of upgrade modules, which can only be used when accessing an upgrade terminal somewhere in the level. The players can find modules hidden in more out-of-the-way places, usually 2 or 3 at a time, but they're most often given to the player on completion of a major task as a reward.
I'm uploading some cybernetic modules.
But wait, aren't they physical items? Hey, kids in your crazy Star Trek magic out. Combat skills are pretty limited. All the player has to worry about are standard weapons, energy weapons, and heavy weapons, as well as exotic weapons which get introduced about halfway through the game. Tech has a couple more. You've got hacking, which is pretty self-explanatory, research, which allows a player to look at special items dropped by enemies to get buffs, and 3 skills related to weapons. There's modification, allowing the player to upgrade their weapons, maintenance, which allows the player to use an item to improve the condition of unjammed weapons, and repair, which is like maintenance but only for weapons that have jammed. Why repair and maintenance aren't just 1 skill, I don't know, but it's interesting that the majority of the tech class's skills are things that will benefit the combat class. Put a pin in that, we're gonna talk about that shortly. Lastly, there's Sci, which is different because it acts almost exactly like magic classes in D&D in that there's a bunch of varied abilities organized into tiers. The higher tiered abilities consume more Sci points when cast, as well as cost more upgrade modules to unlock. Interestingly though, the player needs to first purchase access to the tier, which is really costly. Each tier costs its number multiplied by 10, so purchasing access to tier 2 costs 20 modules, with tier 5 being an exception, jumping up to 75 modules. This does come with a benefit though. Purchasing access to the tier increases the player's maximum Sci points, so it's like the game is preparing the player for these higher cost abilities. Lastly, pertaining to class building are these things called OS upgrades, of which there are only 4 in the game. These allow the player to choose one of 16 passive effects, which are all pretty impressive, but once the player chooses one, it's permanent. While some are clearly catered to a specific class, such as no longer taking damage from overcasting psi abilities, some are still useful to every playstyle, like this one that just gives the player 8 upgrade modules. No, take them, I insist. They're cluttering up my medicine cabinet, my son keeps leaving them around the house. Now we can get into the meat of how these systems interact. Obviously, I'm not going to look at interactions between every single skill and stat because...
Holy shit!
However, remember me mentioning most of the tech skills benefiting the combat class? Well, there's a lot of other skills the players can obtain in one class in order to help their performance in another. There's the tech skills I just mentioned, but there's also psi abilities to temporarily boost each stat, as well as to temporarily stop weapons from taking damage, and to remotely hack things. And combat benefits the other classes by keeping the player not dead. So it's quite plausible to devote yourself to sticking entirely within one class and one class only, but the game tries to encourage you not to. This is also noticeable with the upgrade costs for stats. To increase a skill from level 0 to level 1, the player needs to spend 10 or 12 upgrade modules for tech or combat, respectively. However, to get those to level 2, the player only needs to pay 5 or 6, respectively, meaning it's more economically sound to invest in a skill once you have it than spend modules on a skill you don't have yet. The cost of upgrading doesn't surpass the cost of obtaining a new skill until trying to upgrade to level 4, meaning that the quote-unquote ideal player in System Shock 2 will have a number of skills at level 3 or 4 before considering upgrading any further. To wrap up the systems talk of System Shock 2, let's bring back that idea of generating stories through gameplay. See, the thing is that you're going to fail a lot in System Shock 2. I mean, yes, that includes dying. However, the main system of all 3 classes have some form of failure built in. For combat, the weapons can jam in the middle of a fight. For psi, you can overcast an ability and damage yourself. And for tech, you can critically fail at hacking security and set off an alarm. Yet this game doesn't stop you once this happens. You have to live in the emergent moment that results from this. This is where the therefore or but rule comes in. Again, every beat in a story will ideally have 2 elements combined to create a resolution, a therefore, or a new conflict, a but. For an example, let's take a look at a common obstacle, a security camera. This creates the premise, I was going from point A to point B, but a security camera was in the way. If after a couple seconds the player is still visible to the camera, it sets off an alarm and enemies come running to your position as long as it's still active. However, you can deactivate the alarm by frobbing a security station. Given all the systems we've covered, let's take a look at all the different stories that can play out from our premise here. I was going from point A to point B, but a security camera was in the way, but I fired at it and destroyed it before the alarm went off, therefore I could proceed. I was going from point A to point B, but a security camera was in the way, but I fired at it, but I missed, therefore the alarm went off, therefore I was attacked by enemies. I was going from point A to point B, but a security camera was in the way, but I went to use psi to shoot a fireball at it, but I didn't have enough psi points, therefore I used an item to replenish some, therefore I could shoot a fireball. I was going from point A to point B, but a security camera was in the way, but I already hacked the security system, therefore I could proceed without incident. I was going from point A to point B, but a security camera was in the way, but I ran under it to try to hide, therefore I was successful, therefore I could run the rest of the way when it was looking the other way. I was going from point A to point B, but a security camera was in the way, but I ran under it to try to hide, but I wasn't successful, therefore the alarm went off. But there was a security station nearby, therefore I was able to deactivate the alarm quickly. And there's a lot more variants that could result from this. And think about this, all of these situations and more result from one of the most basic and common scenarios in the game. This overlaps with encouraging varied class builds as well. If you fail with one class's solution, having another class's skills to fall back on is very handy. This, I think, is what gets to the heart of the immersive sim. When the player fails in most other games, typically that's it. They either get a game over screen and have to restart from a checkpoint, or they get stuck in an area where going back to the start is the only path available. System Shock 2 rejects this by allowing the player to get stuck in a mess of their own creation. However, the game only does this in order to provide them an opportunity to get themselves out of it. Unless you haven't reactivated the reconstructor thingy. Then you're on your own. Okay, so MedSci Deck, an abbreviation of medical and science, is the first proper level in the game. However, it's worth covering the actual first levels in the game because they're fairly explicit tutorials. The first map takes place on Earth, where the player enters a military recruitment center. They're prompted to enter the basic training, which covers basic gameplay that everyone needs to know, including throbbing objects, inventory management, and proper usage of light cycles. This is followed by advanced training, which is class-specific. Players get a basic rundown of combat, tech, and Sci gameplay, and it's pretty well done. During the training, the game gives players higher skills and stats, as well as items, in order to let them preview what they could eventually be doing, and makes sure to take those advantages away once the player completes the course. Right after that, the player chooses to enlist in one of the 3 branches which correspond to a class: Marines for combat, Navy for tech, and the OSA for Sci. After this, the player is transported to a space station where they get to choose from 3 sets of 3 missions, which allocate points into different stats and skills, depending on what they choose. This is an interesting approach because instead of a typical character creation screen where points are allocated individually, System Shock 2 makes the player choose from pre-selected bundles. For instance, Door 1 of the first set of missions gives the player both +1 strength and +1 hacking. Paired with the training and enlisting though, it's evident that Irrational and Looking Glass were putting an emphasis on diegesis, meaning having elements exist in the world of the game. Typical character creation screens don't exist in the game world. If the player character saw them, they'd think,
Am I but a simulacrum?
but going through doors is totally normal. This plays into the immersive part of the immersive sim. Generally speaking, anything that reminds the player that they're playing a game takes them out of it. But this also explains the bundling aspect of the stats. If the player had to choose between a door for each stat and skill, and then do that for every point the game decided to give the player initially, that would get tedious very quickly. The approach the game takes is simply there to speed things along. So, after selecting 3 missions, the player wakes up aboard the Von Braun, the ship where most of the game takes place. From here on out, I'm going to split up the level between objectives and focus on the critical path, or the golden path, which is the shortest route between objectives for the player to take. Fortunately, the first section of this level is really linear, so the critical path is the only path. Unfortunately, it makes this section feel really weird. Basically, this intro, the cryogenics section, is a series of skill gates, obstacles that are specifically placed when a new gameplay concept is being introduced to the player to prevent them from continuing until they've shown the ability to use that skill. They basically enable the designer to incorporate tutorials into the level itself. But we already had a ton of tutorials earlier. I get that it's tough to cover everything this game is capable of in a few small maps, but some of this information is redundant. Using an energy recharger to charge weapons and getting info from audio logs were already covered. And some aspects are so basic they could have been included easily in the first level, like opening a door with a keycard. I mean, what kind of person makes an introductory piece of content and forgets to put additional information in it? Oh. Anyways, the level starts with a cutscene showing the player boarding the Von Braun, the ship where most of the game takes place, and being woken up from cryosleep a few months after launch. A voiceover tells them they've been woken by Dr. Janice Polito, the head computer scientist in the crew, because of some emergency on the ship. She instructs the player to then use an elevator to come find her office on Deck 4, doing an effective job of communicating the first major goal of the game, which takes up the first few hours. Fortunately, the level starts out with something it did make sense to hold off on. The player immediately hears Polito say, "Look out!" and sees a satellite dish exploding, then drifting into and cracking the window in front of them. The player then sees an air duct blocking the ladder, the only way out of the room. Looking behind them though, they find a body and, through looting it, obtain a wrench. The player then climbs up the ladder, goes through a door, then sees a duct fall in front of them due to another explosion, and is told by Polito to hurry up because the air is being sucked out of the broken glass. This opening sequence teaches the player a few things. Glass can be broken, you can pick up and use melee weapons, you can break ducts, you can climb up ladders, and ceiling vents can fall down. While I think the melee weapons and ladders could have been covered earlier, the environment the tutorials take place in is cyberspace, though that took me several times to pick up. Introducing destructible objects like glass and ducts makes more sense in an environment where they're actually present instead of cyberspace. Further along, the player goes through a couple of gates, first using a button to open a door, then using a key card to open a door, then getting a keypad code from an audio log and entering that into a door, which is all redundant or could have been covered earlier. In this next room, though, is a great scripted sequence. On the other side of the window, a screaming woman runs down a hallway and out of sight. Right after her comes an enemy with a shotgun who pauses in front of the window to fire and then runs after her. Much like the head crab example I covered in my last video, this sequence introduces the first enemy to the player in a way that's safe, but still communicates danger. Putting this through a window is also a clever use of framing. In essence, it forms a movie screen, which allows the designer to more closely choreograph what the player sees. Putting the player in this small room also prevents them from moving around a lot, allowing the designer to more or less know what angle the player will view it from. After that, the player goes through a vent and drops down into a room with a giant door. There's a station in the wall, a dead battery on the floor, and a charger nearby, so naturally the player recharges the battery and plugs it in. Again, a lot of this feels redundant, especially since energy chargers were already covered in the tutorials, and it's also really weird how Polito re-explains how an energy charger works.
This power cell is dead. There should be a recharger nearby. Just use it and it will recharge all the power-driven devices in your possession.
Getting past this door to safety from the vacuum of space, though, she rewards the player with her first 4 upgrade modules, which is fitting because the first upgrade stations are in the next room. This is also the point where the layout relaxes a bit, allowing the player to run around a small area instead of being kept on rails. This also fits the fiction. The player was, up to this point, kept in a cramped, linear area and urged to keep moving in order to avoid being sucked into space, but once they're behind the safety of an airlock and the urgency is gone, the level moves outward into something less claustrophobic. Now given a chance to relax, the player can go explore in a couple of side rooms without getting too far from the critical path. There's a body right next to the upgrade stations that will give the player 4 more modules and a hackable keypad in the next room over. After the player goes up the lift and over to the door leading to the science sector, they have their first encounter with a ghost. It gives the player information that the recently deceased character lost their keycard nearby. Sure enough, the door head is locked. Doubling back and going to the right, the player enters the room where the characters keep all the keyboards, and finds the keycard on the floor. There's also a body and a glass case right next to it the player can get supplies from. The player can then head back towards the door and unlock it, where they're rewarded with 4 more modules from Polito. This, however, is a very important moment as the player is now exposed to enemies, and, in my mind, is where System Shock 2 really starts. I've had this image burnt into my mind ever since playing this game for the first time, but recently at my job I've learned why that is, and I'm going to tell you here
Because I'm smart, damn it!
I'm not going to do this for every part of the level, but this is probably a good time to talk about lighting and composition. Lighting in 3D games is very important, not just because the player, needs to see, but because it can provide several functions. It can be used to highlight a path or clue the player in on an important item or area, but one of its most pervasive uses is to help communicate space by casting silhouettes. This helps something called the initial read, a player's first look at an area composed in a way to help them understand the layout. Taking a look at this read, we can see there's a couple of paths before us. One to the left, which quickly results in a dead end, one to the right, which we can't see much more of, and one stretching ahead. There's a couple of focal points in this photo, and they're all more brightly lit than the surrounding environment. There's this door left of center, as well as the window to the room it goes to. Through it, plain as day, we can see the first enemy the player is going to encounter in the game. Because we've already shown the player this enemy and communicated its danger, the player is able to recognize it and realize it's going to come through this door. It's also worth noting that this dead end to the left is dimly lit, communicating that it's not important. Off to the right is another illuminated door, but again it's kind of cut off from this initial read. What's more interesting is the hallway in the center. It's illuminated to show the player that this is a path they can take, from both the door light we mentioned earlier and some green light shining through a window we can't see from this angle. Way off in the distance, however, is another hallway bending off to the left. We can tell this because it's more brightly lit than this corner here. Given that there's such a huge disparity in the lighting, your brain is able to interpret these as two different surfaces, and as such, uses that as a cue for depth perception, giving you a mental model of the 3D space between them. So the game is fully opened up to the player, leaving them exposed to enemies and communicating a couple of ways forward. I think, however, it's this first area that deters most people from getting further in the game. After having their first combat experience with two enemies, they're called hybrids by the way, the player's probably going to look right to get a better sense of what's there because it was cut off in the initial read. This is also a good example of lighting used to highlight goals, as the elevator here is noticeably brighter than everything else, indicating the player should go over there. Going over to the elevator, the player tries to activate it and is told by Polito it's jammed. However, Polito follows this up by succinctly telling the player how to fix this.
That insipid computer Xerxes has shut down the elevator as well. You can transfer power at the engine core on deck 1, which will get the elevator up and running again.
Okay, so go to deck 1.
Use the elevator to get down there.
No?
Wait.
Okay.
There's some kind of maintenance access right on this hallway.
Oh, okay, the maintenance
You
hatch
can
right
use it
there.
to reach deck 1.
Yes.
However, it's locked, and Xerxes is hiding the passcode from me.
What?
Dr. Watts should have the code. He's probably in the crew subsection.
Okay, Dr. Watts in the crew subsection. Wait, what?
In the medical subsection.
No, medical
Probably
subsection?
near the
What
bio-
do you want? What do you want? So, this near monologue takes almost a whole minute and is confusing as shit. And if I had to put money on it, I think it's exactly this that prevents more people from progressing further. First off, the game is asking players to remember a lot at once by telling them to get a key card from someone in the medical section so that they can access the crew section and get a code from someone there so that they can go to deck 1 to power up the elevator. Never mind the fact that the first sentence also introduced Xerxes, the security computer, as a character. Second, this was all given to the player in reverse order, so they need to keep this all in mind and mentally reverse it. It's a good thing Polito repeats the first thing they need to do, but repeating everything they needed to do in the right order would have been better. It would have sounded condescending as all hell, but that kind of fits the tone the game has been creating for Polito's character. I wonder why that is. Finally, the player just had to fend off the first two enemies they've encountered in the game, so I can't imagine sticking around an exposed hallway to listen to all of this is what the player's hankering to do at that moment. So from here we'll start our next critical path, which is getting the player to the medical section. I want to mention some quick positive things about this layout though. The maintenance hatch is right next to the elevator, which is good because at least the player knows where to go back to. It's also great that there's these windows looking into the room showing this robot enemy moving around, which makes the player realize, oh, I'm gonna have to deal with that, aren't I? And yes they are. So, assuming the player doesn't go through these bulkheads or around the corner where this security camera is, the player's probably thinking to themselves, well, I gotta find the entrance to the medical section, so where should I start looking? Hey, wait a minute. Wasn't there a place I saw when I first entered? Boom! The power of reads. Or I guess I could loop around the hall and around the other way or whatever. Going back around this corner, there's a couple of side rooms here of interest. First, there's the one where the first enemy was visible, which has a security terminal the player can hack. There was one by the elevator, but again, the player probably feels very exposed in that hallway, especially given it's in the middle of a four-way intersection. The other room contains an enemy, but also has a bioreconstructor. To keep things simple, let's assume the player finds and activates this. Around the bend, the player sees the bulkhead to the medical and crew section, but is greeted by an explosion and a burn mark on the wall where a power station is. Polito then tells the player to pick up the empty cell on the floor and find an energy charger. There's a security camera around the corner though. If the player doesn't have a firearm, they can run and grab the cell quickly, but if they're not feeling bold enough, hopefully they saw those security terminals earlier. So now the player has to turn around to find an energy charger, which was effectively set up for the player a few minutes ago in the opening section. Even if it shouldn't have been there. From this point, things get a little more open-ended and there's several areas they could go. To the left, past where the bioreconstructor is, there's a large room centered around a terminal of Xerxes where another enemy should be hanging out. From here, there's a hallway to another entrance to the medical and crew section, but it requires a keycard. Right behind there is another security camera, and to the left of that is a turret on the other side of this weird V-shaped incline. Going right at the Xerxes terminal, though, is the hallway where the player first saw that security camera right by the elevator. We'll come back to that area later. What's important is the bulkhead in the middle here, leading to a small room. To the left is a chemical storage room, which is important if the player has the research skill. Ahead, though, is an area with a single enemy with a ladder down and a couple walkways above a room below. And look there, an energy charger. I guess we'll just go mosey on over there and activate. Now, there's a lot of situations the Duke boys were prepared for. Being shot at by a couple of turrets on a faster-than-light spacecraft was not one of them.
Is a class 3 infection.
Okay, so just rushing through there isn't the smartest thing to do. But it's worth noting how the game set the player up for this situation. All throughout the level, the player's been incentivized to run up to corpses and search them for items, because these items act as rewards for the player's behavior. And here, right between where the player climbs down the ladder and the recharger, is a corpse ripe for the looting, although I will admit it's not very well lit here. However, right before this is the trigger that opens the doors to the turrets, which also causes the lights to shut off, emphasizing that "oh shit" moment. Additionally, the alcoves are lit using a foreboding red glow, communicating danger. This room, though, is a microcosm of what I think really works in System Shock 2's level design, in that it gives you many different options to deal with a situation. If the players already hack the security system, then nothing happens and they can use the recharger easily. From the walkways above, the player can use these conveniently stacked crates to climb down. The walkways are also supported with beams that conveniently block the sight lines of these turrets, so the player could feasibly shoot at them from behind cover or run past them. What's most telling, though, are the item drops in the area. I haven't been fastidiously going over every item found in every container in the walkthrough because, again,
Holy shit!
but the items provided in this area are probably the most blatant in communicating the designer's intent. First off was the body right by the enemy encountered by the top of the ladder. Search it and you get 6 armor-piercing pistol rounds, which are especially effective against turrets. Second, on top of those crates is a psi hypo in case the player is more inclined to use those to fight the turrets. Finally, on the body lying as bait, there's a medical hypo the player can use to heal themselves, as well as 2 upgrade modules. It's almost like they knew you were gonna get hurt or something. Once the player recharges the battery, it's pretty smooth sailing back to the bulkhead to the medical section. Going through, the game loads up a new map, and the player is greeted with another 4-way intersection. To the right is a bulkhead to the crew quarters, which requires a keycard, a thing Polito reminds the player of here. In front of the player is a small area that has nothing to do with the critical path, and to the left is where the player needs to go. Going around the bend, the player can see in the room to the right that there's a bioreconstructor there. Putting it in a place so blatant is a big improvement from the reconstructor's placement in the previous map, as it's directly on the critical path. Additionally, in here, the player is introduced to the surgery bed, a thing that the player can frub and heal themselves completely at the cost of 5 nanites, which in this game is really inexpensive. If the player went forward from the map start, they could go into this room on the 2nd floor and find a surgery bed key, which is used to activate incomplete surgery beds later on in the game, and is a really useful item. Going through the center of this S-shaped hallway, Polito explains to the player that they may see more ghosts, which are the last recorded moments when someone dies, visible to people with certain implants. Indeed, there's another one in this side room. The game often uses these to communicate information to the player. For instance, we already mentioned the first ghost prompting the player to go find the keycard to unlock MedSci, and there's also one by the Xerxes terminal hinting that the player can hack vending machines. Straight ahead is a T-shaped junction with a security camera placed right at the corner to another hallway. To the left of that bend is a door to a couple rooms where an enemy is hanging out, though they'll need to be cautious because the camera can see them through the window there. At this point, the player is probably still ruminating on the philosophical implications of these ghosts. Seeing the last moments of someone's life, a person stuck on a failing spaceship millions of miles from Earth with hostile life forms on board. And it's all there, visible to those with the technology to see it. How did they feel in their last moments, knowing they're probably going to die in this ship? Oh dear God. No one's coming. We're all going to die in this ship.
Oh dear God, Psychic Monkey!
So these monkeys who use psi abilities are a new enemy introduced here, which is probably good since there's a bioreconstructor and a surgery bed right behind the player. These enemies also differentiate themselves from the hybrids. While hybrids attacked the player using either melee or hit scan weapons, the monkeys shoot psi projectiles that actually take time to travel through the air. This is pretty similar to the enemy dichotomy setup in Doom. If you haven't, you should really watch Mark Brown's video on this. However the player chooses to get past the camera, they can proceed down the hall after encountering a monkey, passing a security terminal on the way. Going around the bend, the player hits a trigger, Xerxes says a thing, and then two hybrids with shotguns come running down the hall. There's an awkwardly placed pillar in the middle here, but that's obviously to serve as cover from the turret at the end of this really long hall. Towards the end on the right, there's a window followed by a door leading into the biopsy lab where the player's trying to head. However, there's a camera in the far corner that can spot the player through these, as well as another monkey the player's going to need to deal with simultaneously. Of interest is the ladder to the left here. The player can take it up to a bonus area with some helpful items, but needs to take it down to the bottom floor. Here the player first hears psychic communications from the Many, an alien hive mind serving as one of the main antagonists of the game, responsible for the player's former co-workers being turned into hybrids. Down here, however, is a body with a keycard to the cruise section, and Polito rewards the player with 5 more modules before they head back to the beginning of the map to open that locked door. Before moving on, I should point out another way of getting to the biopsy lab here. From that T-junction by the camera, the player can take a right, go around this U-bend, and find themselves in this side room. There's a couple of areas here to explore, this small room here, as well as an area that introduces radiation that gradually hurts the player. However, breaking this window right here and going through allows the player to enter the biopsy lab from the back, out of sight of the camera and circumventing the turret entirely. The player then goes to the door to the cruise sector to unlock it, and is immediately given a warm welcome by being ambushed from behind by a hybrid. There's also another enemy patrolling this hallway from up ahead, though the player can duck into these side rooms to get the jump on them, as well as take all the diet soda on the ship, you fucking... Going through this door, the player enters the main area of the crew quarters. To the right is some sort of office area with a security terminal and a locked small armory behind there. What's really interesting is how difficult this keypad is to hack, and that there's an audio log nearby telling the player that the code to it is on deck 4, letting them know to keep an eye out when they reach that level. More importantly, however, is that this audio log communicates that once the player gets the elevator up and running, they'll be able to freely travel between decks, so if there's something they're not able to do quite yet here, don't sweat it. To the left of the entrance is a bar area with the stat upgrade stations, and ahead and to the right is the first OS upgrade the player has access to. Just remember kids, make sure you're sober before you decide on your upgrade. What do you think these are, tattoos? Right by the OS station is a bulkhead that leads back to the area by the Xerxes terminal we mentioned earlier, so now that the player has the keycard to this area, they can unlock this path. First though, they have to track down the office of the doctor who knows the code to the maintenance shaft. Further past the bulkhead is the main hall where the meat of this section is. It does something interesting here by splitting this area into 2 different floors, lengthwise, essentially creating 2 paths for the player to take. There's a hybrid patrolling the area, coming towards this area from the bottom and going back across the top, as well as a security camera on the other side of these pillars, both restricting its field of view and concealing it from the player. Lastly, on the far side of the area, another hybrid is hanging out with a shotgun. There's a couple of interesting things of note here. First is this room on the upper floor with an armory in it. It's actually blocked by a force field, which can be deactivated by hacking this terminal here. Players still need to be careful after that though, as there's a security camera in the closet there. Second, right behind the security camera in the hallway, there's a pistol in fairly good condition that players with the telekinesis psi ability will be able to snag. At the end of the hall and to the right is the office the player is looking for. On entry, Polito notes that he's not here, but searching his desk gives the player a keycard to the research wing on this deck, and the player receives 5 more modules from Polito. After going back to the main area of the crew quarters, the player is able to go through the bulkhead and end up right by the Xerxes terminal. then take a left and end up at that 4-way intersection by the elevator, facing the hallway with the security camera on the end. It's finally time to actually go down this hallway, as it leads to the research section, so the player is going to have to deal with this camera somehow. Going around the corner to the left, the player sees a bulkhead off in the distance, but there's some rooms to the left the player can explore if they like, this first section containing a hybrid and a monkey to fend off. However, this area on the right through the window looks kind of familiar, right? Hey, wasn't that the area where the player first saw a hybrid through the window? Which means the player is now in the hallway where that sequence took place. Ooh, creepy. Going through the bulkhead, there's another room to the left with another hybrid, as well as this lower area in front with yet another enemy hanging out. There's also this window the player can look through with a person on a gurney visible on the other side. Turns out that's the person with the code you're looking for, Dr. Watts, so the player gets this visual confirmation of progress. Going back up the ladder here, around the corner is a locked bulkhead, which the player can unlock using the research wing keycard and receive another 4 modules from Polito once passing through. The first thing the player is going to have to deal with is this camera right by the door. Though there's a security terminal nearby, it's right in the middle of the camera's line of sight. Taking the door on the right, the player enters a circuitous hallway that wraps around this research room in the center. Making their way through, the player doesn't encounter too many enemies aside from this other camera outside the room where Dr. Watts is. Going through the door, the player finds themselves on a balcony overlooking the room below where a hybrid enemy is located. After taking them out, the player can use the lift nearby to get down and walk over to Dr. Watts. A sequence plays where Dr. Watts warns the player with their dying breath about the many. After he dies, the player searches his corpse to find an audio log with the goddamn maintenance key code, finally! Woo! This victory is pretty short, however, as 2 hybrids enter the room onto the balcony, which the player is going to have to deal with. The player then starts their trek back to the elevator. Now, a designer should always try to put themselves into the mind of a player, but especially in this moment, try to think of what's going through their head right now. After going through a ton of crap, they've got the code to go through the maintenance tunnels to power up the elevator. However, they recall that the entrance is guarded by that giant robot, so they're probably planning ahead while running back down this hallway. Okay, so does the player have any armor-piercing rounds? Do they have enough psi points to launch a couple of abilities at them? Maybe they could open the door and kind of duck to the side while, hey, what are you doing there? You are not supposed to be there. This is one of the great things about System Shock 2 and how it effectively sets up situations to scare the player. They routinely set up an expectation in the player's mind about how a situation is going to play out in the future and completely throw that out the window. This jolts the player as they have to reorganize their plans they created, making the situation a bit harder since it has to be improvised in the face of danger. The game routinely puts players in situations they're unprepared for, but are not insurmountable in order to keep the difficulty fair. However the player wants to deal with the repair bot, the player punches in the key code to the door. Wait, if the door is still locked, how did the robot get out? The player then takes this lift down, gets berated by Polito one last time, then heads down the hatch to finally get to the engineering deck, and we are done! Whew boy! Now who wants a homebrew? I made it myself. It's a Weizenbach. Now that we've gone through a solid 45-ish minutes of gameplay, we should take a closer look at what works and what doesn't in System Shock 2's level design. There's a few obvious things that are problems, mostly because this game is almost 20 years old, so we have the benefit of hindsight. As I mentioned before, I think the aspect that's most off-putting to new players is this giant info dump right at the elevator. Additionally, after completing MedSci, the player needs to go through another level, the engineering deck, in order to get this goddamn elevator moving, which takes a total playtime of about 3 hours. As such, the beginning of this game may feel really arduous and unrewarding, but that feeling is definitely alleviated once the player reaches Deck 3 and this game starts treating each deck as a discrete level. What I think would work better is if this information were doled out in more digestible chunks as the player completed sub-objectives in the level. The level already does this about half the time. Polito's all like, hey, go to the medical section, and the player's all like, okay. But then they get to the bulkhead and Polito's like, hey, you can't go through there because his battery's not charged, so you gotta charge the battery. And the player's still like, okay. Similarly, this happens when the player goes to the crew sector and is redirected to the research wing. How about, instead of the large amount of exposition, we try this? The player activates the elevator and Polito says, looks like it's broken, you'll have to get to the deck below, but the hatch is locked with a key code. Dr. Watts knows it and he's in the medical section, go find him. It's still a bit much because Polito has to mention going to the engineering deck, but it is simpler. Then when the player goes to the biopsy lab in the medical wing, Polito says, hey, looks like he's not here, but there's a key card to the crew sector, so maybe try there? And then the same thing in the crew sector when the player finds the research wing key card. It may feel like yanking the player's chain a bit too much, but it's definitely easier for the player to follow than
That insipid computer Xerxes has shut down the elevator as well. You can transfer power at the engine core on deck 1, which will get the elevator up and running again. But you can't use the elevator to get down there.
Looking at this game's level design is also sort of tricky because 3D level design practices were still kinda new and being figured out. Like, when I mentioned reeds and lighting earlier, I'm not entirely sure if the designers knew what they were doing. I mean, System Shock 2, obviously they knew what they did. Oh, I'm so sorry, Ken! What I mean to say is, at the time this game was being developed, I'm not sure if anyone had realized how to utilize lighting in this way, but from this angle, it sure seems like it. So, when I criticize this level for being flat, I'm not sure if anyone at the time realized this was going to be an issue. I get that this is supposed to be a deck on a spaceship, and they probably took inspiration from naval ships with flat layouts, hence the term deck being used in the game, but it kind of makes the space in this level feel really uninteresting. There's a couple exceptions though. That side area in the medical section I briefly mentioned has this walkway above the first floor area. This room in the research wing that the main hall wraps around has this ceiling come down, making the room feel like it's split in two. And the room where the player finds Dr. Watts has that balcony entrance. In these specific spaces, the player has to think of space in all three dimensions, and that's way more fun and engaging than flat hallways. One way the game does take advantage of 3D space is the way this level bends back on itself, letting the player see ahead in the level. As I mentioned in my intro video, this is a pretty great way to show the player where to go next, but it also has the added benefit of the player being able to look back at where they just were, giving them an encouraging sense of progress. However, in System Shock 2's case, this seems to further the sense of immersion. These aren't just fragments of movie sets created for scenery, they're places the player can go that exist in space and feel like a proper part of the world. I'd also like to go back to that room with the two turrets we examined. Is it cool if I do that? The number of solutions that are available for the player to utilize in such a small space is impressive. Warren Spector, who helped Looking Glass ship Thief, left to work at Ion Storm during the development of System Shock 2 to create Deus Ex. While heading the design team, Spector kept reminding the team of a mantra: problems, not puzzles. This is a really important distinction, as puzzles most of the time have one intended solution, but like we mentioned earlier, a puzzle may be able to tell a good story, but it can only tell one story. A problem, however, is more open-ended, and allows the player to find the way to tackle it that suits them best. As I mentioned before, every obstacle in System Shock 2 can be dealt with using different skills from different classes, but this also extends outwards into the layout of the level itself and the way these obstacles are arranged. Not only does this create more interesting levels, but it's kinda necessary given that this is an RPG. This approach is still used in modern RPGs as well, because if the player is confronted with a problem that their character build has no way of solving, they're just going to get frustrated and give up. Isn't that right, body of the many? A major difference in System Shock 2's levels, though, is that they're more constrained than what you generally find in other immersive sims. This is definitely influenced by the fact that you're on a spaceship, but it goes a bit deeper. Typically, in a Thief level, the player is told to go to a particular area on the map, but they're given several different paths to get there, all with their unique situations that the player is going to have to solve, and a lot of Deus Ex's maps follow the same principle. Quite frequently, however, the problems System Shock 2 throws at the player can't be circumvented. You have a plethora of options to get down to that energy charger, but you gotta get down to that energy charger. Despite this, though, levels in this game don't feel linear or claustrophobic, at least most of them. While having those preview areas where the path folds back in on itself helps, this is mostly because the problems the player confronts are at designated choke points, guaranteeing that the player has to go through a specific point in space. They're given a fairly open area to search for supplies and look for a solution for this problem, but they're going to have to go back through this bottleneck eventually. Combined with a liberal use of key card and keypad locks, the player is constrained at first. But as the player progresses, more and more areas and more paths between them become unlocked. Take a look at MedSci's layout. The initial area the player is given is constricted by doors to the medical, crew, and research wings. Accomplishing the first goal, recharging the battery, unlocks the medical wing. Here the player can obtain the crew quarters keycard, unlocking that wing, and providing a second path back to the starting area. And finally, obtaining the research keycard unlocks that wing. It's worth noting then that this lets the designer keep control over pacing, as it specifies the sequence of the events the player is going to have to face. Lastly, it seems thematically appropriate to force the player into a situation here because, unlike Deus Ex and Thief, this is a horror game. A big part of this has to do with the sound design for enemies. A lot of the life forms that belong to the many the player encounters later on have absolutely disgusting, spine-chilling sound effects associated with each of them, showing that this is some top-notch audio work. So, forcing the player into a bottleneck where a lot of these enemies might be located, they can hear and pick out what types of enemies might be nearby, but not how many there are or what their exact location is. Lacking that information, as well as hearing those disturbing sounds from the other side of a wall, makes the player reticent to go in there, but the levels are all constructed so that a crucial item or piece of information is in there. Much like the repair bot at the end of MedSci, the game creates scenarios that are fair but that the player is unprepared for. Gently nudging the player into a situation they don't want to be in is a great way to cultivate horror, so allowing the player to choose a different path and circumvent these entirely would kind of undercut that. So with all that in mind, I think we figured out some of System Shock 2's design philosophy. First off, I'm going to steal Warren Spector's problems not puzzles philosophy. Every encounter should try to provide a solution for each class as well as a couple for if the player runs out of supplies. Second, try to create problems with approaches that require using more than one class's skills. Entering the biopsy lab, the player can hack security systems to disable the turret and camera, but still needs to fend off the hybrids and monkey using combat or side. This keeps problems interesting and reinforces the cost of upgrade modules, encouraging the player to invest in multiple skills. Third, use these problems to section off chunks of the level and create choke points, making the player have to deal with them directly. If you can make these problems creepy and unsettling to deal with, all the better. Fourth, as the player unlocks new areas of the level, allow them to unlock new paths and shortcuts in order to cut down on backtracking and make the level feel more open. And lastly, utilize previews in order to cement the believability of the environment, as well as let players know what's coming up, and giving them encouragement that they're making progress as they move throughout the level. Of course, make sure the area that they're looking at is actually accessible. Additionally, there's some things that I think could improve on the level design that I'd like to propose. First, put the bioreconstructor as close to the expected entrance of the level as possible. I get that some maps have the player able to enter from multiple areas, so that's not always possible. I also get that having it automatically activate would make the player disoriented on being resurrected, so having them activate it manually makes them remember where it is. However, having it placed about halfway through a map creates a sharp drop in difficulty when it's activated, something that the designer is going to have to take into account. Having the difficulty before this point increased because the player can't be revived makes it feel kind of artificially hard. I think it's best to get this out of the way as soon as possible, or at least place the reconstructor right before where combat is expected to start. Additionally, reviving the player feels way more in line with the idea of giving the player opportunities to recover from failure. It might be a bit tedious, but having the player need to walk back to where they were serves as punishment, though I think them having spent resources on their last failed attempt is more effective at this. Another small note, I'd make sure the bioreconstructor is in a safe area where enemies can't gain access. This will prevent the player from being frustratingly cornered inside one. Lastly, utilize 3D space as much as possible to create interesting looking spaces that challenge the player's sense of navigation and keeps them engaged even when they're moving around. So where does this leave us with System Shock 2's quality? Well, as I've alluded to, the first two levels, MedSci and Engineering, are kind of a rough start for the game, requiring the player to accomplish their first major objective by completing both decks, making the player feel like they're running around in circles for the first several hours before accomplishing it. Additionally, my comments on levels in System Shock 2 being prevented from feeling linear really don't hold up when looking at certain areas in Engineering, though there are areas in that level I love. Additionally, I had that throwaway joke. You remember the one? No? Huh. I had the throwaway joke about the body of the many, which, while a really cool environment, suffers from breaking a lot of rules of the design philosophy, including being overly linear and way too focused on combat and sci. So if you invested all your modules and tech skills, you're kind of shit out of luck, and apparently you're supposed to have killed the brainstem at the end while avoiding the enemies to get to the last level, not that I'm bitter. But that stretch in between those levels? Oh, beautiful. It's such a well done slab of game that I'm pretty sure that's the segment that almost all of its reputation rests upon. And the people involved in System Shock 2 have since gone on to do even more great projects. Most famously, Irrational created BioShock when they couldn't secure the rights to System Shock 3. And though Looking Glass Games went under soon after, many of their employees ended up at places like Ion Storm, Arcane, and even Otherside Entertainment, because of whom, after all these years, we'll finally get a chance to see a sequel to this game. As for me, I'm just happy I finally took the opportunity to sit down and dissect what makes one of my favorite games so great despite its warts. Figuring out how the designers force the player into facing problems and realizing how the levels branch out as the player progresses was a real revelation to me. I've known for quite some time how much I love this game, but as I've started to venture into the world of professional game development, I finally figured out why, and I think I appreciate it even more for that. And I know what you're thinking, well gee, anyone could prattle on for an 18-page script and make it sound convincing while not putting any of this into practice. And of course I find this silly, because it's not like there's an actual level editor for System Shock 2 that's publicly available or any... Hey, wait a minute. What is this program that I've clearly already installed on my computer? Oh, yeah! Oh, yeah! Woo! Yeah, baby! Woo! Yeah! You rotate that brush. You rotate. You put that entity there. You're portalize that sucker. Woo! I offered. Hey guys, it's me, Jared Mitchell, host of The Playing Field and America's favorite level designer. I don't actually think that's true. So I know some of you must be thinking, wow Jared, that was a funny joke about the System Shock 2 editor, but come on, you're not actually going to create a finished level in that editor. That thing's ancient, right? Well, you'd be wrong. I mean, it's not quite out yet. See, the thing is, making a level in that editor, as well as making this video, as well as working on the game I'm involved in as part of my day job, is a lot to do all at once, so I've pushed back the level just a couple of weeks, and that'll be out soon, just so I can ensure that it's to the best quality that I can make it. So okay, where's this level going to be posted when it's done? Where can I access it? Well, I'm going to post it on my new Patreon page. That's right, I'm opening a Patreon, and anyone who donates $5 or more per video to the playing field will get access to this level. And I plan on, in the future, when covering other games, making levels for the games I discuss, provided that they have a level editor freely available for people to use. I'll also try my best to provide documentation that I create over the course of designing and implementing this level and giving that to you just so you can see how someone might approach the process of creating a level. Now, to be clear, creating a finalized level in anything these days, especially with more recent technology, is a lot of effort and can take months, if not years. So the levels I create, don't expect them to look on par with any finished levels of any games that I might discuss. Typically, I'm going to aim for something that's about 5 to 10 minutes of length in gameplay, and these things are probably not going to look amazing, but the priority of a level designer is to create a level first and foremost that is fun to play. And so for every level I create corresponding to a game, I'm going to try my best to create a level that mimics the design philosophy that I sort of deduce over the course of the video, and I certainly invite my patrons to critique my work as well. Additionally, for my patrons, I may occasionally sort of tool around with some sort of gameplay prototype that's interesting me, or I might write an article on a design concept or something within the industry that's interesting me. But mostly I want to make other shorter videos, aside from the level analysis ones, that actually talk about things from a game developer's perspective, talking about issues that affect people who work in games, or might further explain certain roles that are within the game industry. Such as the QA video I just made and put up about a month ago. And I'm sure some of you might be concerned about giving me money when I'm saying I'm a professional game developer and I'm working on a game that will eventually be shipped. Well, under my current contract, I'm actually working in exchange for a % of sales once the game comes out, meaning I'm not actually making any money until this thing is shipped and in the hands of consumers, for people like you. So this Patreon is ideally a way for me to sustain myself until that point. There are some other logistical concerns that I try to address in my Patreon page, but if there are any questions that you have that you feel like haven't been answered, feel free to comment below, or feel free to hit me up on the new Playing Field Twitter account, and I will try my best to get back to you and answer your concerns. So yeah, thank you guys for watching, and this has been the first level analysis video of The Playing Field.